PLATO Society. And I want to certainly welcome all the PLATO guests and all of the people who are friends of longevity and anyone else who is with us today. I'd like to introduce our chair of the colloquium, Ed Robin.
I should acknowledge Jim Adler, who's the real chair and who unfortunately had to be out of town today. Our presenter today, Dr. Robert Peter Gale, has an amazing biography and list of accomplishments. Dr. Gale is a physician, a research scientist, a professor, a bio-entrepreneur, an author of many, many books and even more articles and publications, and an Emmy Award winner. Leukemia and bone marrow disorders are the central themes of Dr. Gale's basic scientific and clinical research for over 35 years. He has firsthand experience with the two major nuclear disasters of our time, Chernobyl and Fukushima. Dr. Gale.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to cover a fairly broad series of topics. Each one of these could be, an hour or a book in itself, and I'm trying to bring those together. I hope we can have enough time to get through them. Incessant, irksome, irritating questioning of all aspects of existence as a deliberate perversity was the charge some of you may recognize against Socrates. My wife said it's a good description of me. And I told her I was giving a lecture. She's in New York right now. I told her I was giving a lecture at the PLATO Society a few months ago, but she somehow confused it with the Socrates Society, which they have at Stanford. In any event, this is Plato, not Socrates. So, fortunate for me. Just a reality check, because I get calls daily. Sabina Jacob, my secretary, is here, can testify to it. People call me and they say, I'm planning to go to Japan, is that safe? And things like that. So Sunday I was walking through the Ginza area of Tokyo, and you can see that most people are not concerned about radiation from Fukushima. That's not the issue in Japan. But there is, this was across from my hotel is Hibiya Park, which is a popular eco-central park, let's say. And these people are about 1 kilometer from the Diet Building. They're waiting in line. These signs say, no more, no nuclear energy, for example. So at the same time, you have a bunch of people strolling the Ginza buying $3,000 Hermes bags, and another bunch of people that are lined up and willing to stand in line for hours and hours to let the government know that they are against nuclear energy. So this is the pest column, the Pesticide in Vienna. Many of you may have seen it. It's on the Graben in Vienna. And Ludwig I built this to commemorate the city's surviving the plague in well, the column was built in 1693. The plague was earlier. Somehow or other, radiation has become a modern plague. People have extraordinary fears about radiation. And so my purpose is to try to understand why that is and to try to put things into a proper perspective for you. So how did we get to this situation that people are so afraid of radiation? It wasn't always the case. This is the first X-ray ever taken. This is the hand of Rankin's wife. Her name was Bertha, and this is her wedding ring on her hand. And perhaps prophetically, when she was shown this X-ray, because no one had ever seen inside a living human body before, she said, I think I have seen my death. So that was more than 150 years ago. But some of you, I think there's some people who might have actually seen one of these. This is an early petoscope. You know, you would go to the, even when I was a kid, we'd go to the shoe store and you could see your feet and you could figure out if you had the proper fit on your shoes. So people were very keen, and shoe stores used that as a way to attract people in. People were very keen to be exposed to radiation. This is a modern version. Some of you may recognize this X-ray from, this is Helmut Newton's version of a petoscope. Okay, and if you go to Bad Gastein, even today in Austria, which is a lovely ski resort, you can pay a lot of money, actually, to sit in a radon cave. These people, they believe that radiation is making them feel good. It, in fact, has, I mean, in some areas of medicine, such as an arthritic disease called ankylosing spondylitis, we still use radiation as a therapy. It works. So what happened, though, that turned radiation from being something that people look forward to, they desired, and so forth, into something they feared? And there are a number of events, no single event, but an accumulation of events. Of course, the atomic bombings in Japan in 1945 was not a good advertisement for radiation. It's a picture of Hiroshima just after the bomb, totally flattened. This is this famous dome of the that stands now as a memorial to the atomic bombs. Many of you have, it's a museum, you may have visited it. And then we've had a number of problems with nuclear power. You'll hear about those, such as the Chernobyl accident in 1986. And this is the city of Pripyat, which is about 4 kilometers away from the Chernobyl accident. And this was a purpose-built city for the nuclear workers. And it's obviously completely deserted and abandoned and will not be decontaminated. And then recently, I think many people saw these hydrogen explosions. These are not nuclear explosions, but hydrogen explosions at the Fukushima accident 2 years ago, and the destroyed reactor complexes. I'll get into these in more detail. And then this is a computer-generated graphic we've made of the release of radiation from Fukushima, and you see it's coming around the globe and coming over to California. So there's this sense that, you know, a radiation accident anywhere puts all of us at risk. And then, you know, we've had to evacuate more than 130,000 people from around the Fukushima area, and we have also these deserted cities. I'll come back to Nami a little later, but this is a city that's about 35 kilometers from the nuclear power station that we have evacuated, and we will rehabilitate it eventually. And then there's another burning issue, which is used nuclear fuels that are all over the world that we don't have a satisfactory repository for. So it's the sort of the accumulation of all of these events that I think has no one, but the accumulation that's sort of flipped people's attitudes about radiation. And then we have, on top of it, you know, some very unpleasant players in Iran. This is their underground nuclear site that the United States and Israel are considering taking out if these talks don't go well. And then some very unstable regimes, such as in North Korea, that have nuclear capabilities. So last summer in London, we had a bunch of, on the anniversary of the Fukushima accident, we had a number of protests. Someone said to me, how can that be, you know, March? But this is what it's like in March in London. You need a coat. So, you know, we had this sort of violent reaction against radiation, nuclear energy. So my purpose is to try to put these things in a bit of perspective. So the first question, of course, is, do we need nuclear energy? And the answer is yes, we do. This is our nuclear reactor. You can step outside and see it. The sun. You know, all life on Earth is dependent on a nuclear reaction that takes place in the sun. Plants capture photons and other particles and waves that are released by the sun, but predominantly photons. And you know, you will remember from high school chemistry that if you take carbon dioxide and water and you add a photon, you get oxygen and sugars. And that's the basis of life on Earth. Without the nuclear reaction in the sun, there's no life on Earth. Now, there are other ways to get oxygen, apparently. I was strolling along Fisherman's Wharf the other day, and apparently you can get oxygen just without the sun. But our major source of oxygen and energy on Earth is the sun. So global photosynthesis is big business. The areas in dark green are the terrestrial areas that have the highest levels of photosynthesis, and the dark blue areas are the oceanic areas with the greatest levels of photosynthesis. But I just want to put this in perspective for you. All of the energy that we use on Earth comes to about 22 terawatts a year. That's total global energy consumption. And the sun provides us with about 6 times more from photosynthesis. So we are heavily, heavily dependent on nuclear energy for life. So I want to talk about radiations, and I'm going to focus on a kind of radiation that we call ionizing radiations, which means that these are things that have enough energy to change a biological substance. And let me explain that a little bit more. So we can divide ionizing radiations into particles and into waves. So there are a bunch of particles. There are atomic and subatomic particles. Some of you have heard of the Higgs boson recently and things like that. But I'm focused on things like neutrons and alpha particles, which are a proton and a neutron, and electrons. And then we have these electromagnetic waves. They have a combination of wave and particle-like properties. And you probably don't realize how important they are in your life, but let me just show you the electromagnetic spectrum. So these are waves, and so we can measure the distance between the peaks of any 2 waves. So these are waves here that have quite a big distance between them, about 1 kilometer between each wave. And here we have waves that are very, very close together. And if you look at this spectrum, here's a frequency for those that are interested in frequency, but around here we have things like radio waves and television. So when you listen to your radio or television, you're dealing with electromagnetic waves. And then we have microwaves, they're here. And then we have infrared that you use to control devices in your home or turn lights on and off. And then we have ultraviolet around here. Now, we as human beings, this is a huge thing. This is a billion orders difference in wavelengths. It's a huge disparity in wavelengths. But as humans, we can only sense this very, very small portion of this huge spectrum, which we appreciate as light, visible light. And the rest of this is unknown to us. So one of the things that makes people afraid of radiation is that, if you see a fire and you put your hand in it, you understand that that's dangerous, so you withdraw your hand. If you go to the edge of a cliff and you look down, you get the picture pretty quickly that this is potentially dangerous. But most of this spectrum is completely undetectable to us. So you don't know, for example, if right now you're being exposed to a lethal amount of radiation. And so we tend to fear things that we can't appreciate, we can't understand. There's an evolutionary basis for most of our other fears, but not for radiation. So the kind of radiation we're interested in this afternoon are these radiations that have very short wavelengths that have enough energy to change biological materials. And they're X-rays and gamma rays, and occasional ultraviolet ray. So I'm going to talk about some terms, and I'll give you a little glossary. Try to make this simple. So I'm going to talk about doses, and the thing that you want to focus on are a thing called millisieverts. So millisieverts is just a measure of the dose of radiation that someone receives, but we adjust it for the fact that not all the tissues in the body are equally sensitive. So your blood cells and your hair, for example, are very sensitive to radiation because they're dividing all the time. The cells are dividing all the time. Our hairs are not dividing all the time. In fact, sometimes they start going away. But our bones are resistant to radiation. So when you take the dose of radiation, we have to adjust it for the sensitivity of the tissue. But I'm going to show you things that are all in millisieverts, or a thousandth of a sievert. So the idea is, don't worry about what it is, we're just going to compare different things in millisieverts. And occasionally we'll talk about radioactivity. So that's different. That's how many times does a thing disintegrate per second. So one is a dose, and one is the amount of radioactivity. I'm sure all of you have heard of curies, but the modern term for this is a becquerel. I'll show you a few things about becquerels. So we have dose and we have amount of radioactivity, and those are two different things. So the average American is exposed to about 6.2 millisieverts of radiation every year, or about 500 millisieverts over our lifetime. That's our normal background radiation exposure. Now, some of you may remember Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine. So is this something to worry about or not? Well, this is a picture of the Chernobyl the sarcophagus that was built around the Chernobyl reactor to contain the exposed nuclear fuel. And you visit this quite often and muck around there. And it was built in quite haste, and it's not perfect, and there's a lot of water and moisture inside. And we recovered some black gunk from the wall of this, and to try to figure out what that was. And it turns out that this black stuff was a fungus that we actually see normally, called Cryptococcus neoformans. Name's not important, but the point I want to make is that this fungus, it's a living thing, is growing in an area of millions and millions and millions of times more radiation than we would ever be exposed to. And amount of radiation that would kill a normal Cryptococcus neoformans. And what this Cryptococcus has done is it's created an energy system to capture all the radiation being released from Chernobyl and turn it into energy. Instead of using chlorophyll, it uses melanin. Melanin is a pigment which is black, and that's why we see these black things on the walls of the Chernobyl sarcophagus. So the point of this is that biological organisms can adapt to very different amounts of radiation if you give them enough time. Okay, so we're back to our average radiation exposure. Where does that come from? Well, we can divide it generally into natural sources of radiation and man-made, and you can see they're roughly equal. If I showed you this pie curve 50 years ago, the man-made part would be incredibly small. So this equal distribution is something of the last 50 years, and particularly something of the last 20 years. And I'll explain to you why that is. So we're going to dissect this out. And the first thing is background radiation that we get from the Earth. The planet Earth is radioactive and contains radioactive radionuclides. So Earth is radioactive, right? It's created in a nuclear explosion. And the Earth contains, the core of the Earth, which is liquid because these radionuclides are decaying and releasing heat. If it wasn't the case, the Earth would be solid, but the Earth is liquid. And it contains a lot of radioactive nuclides, about 200, but things that you may have heard of are radium and uranium and thorium and radon. So we live on a radioactive planet, and by just walking along the surface, of course, we are being irradiated by Earth. And the amount of radiation that we get really depends on where we live. So the areas in pink are areas of high radiation content at the ground, and the areas in blue are low radiation content. So here we are in LA, and that's a relatively low area of radiation. We're at sea level. We're not on a rocky base. And here's Denver. And Denver is right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, sitting on all this radium and radon and thorium. So depending on where you live, it determines how much radiation you get. So here are the Rockies. Now there's another issue. It's hard to get sometimes LA looks like this, but only occasionally. But also Denver is a mile closer to the sun than is LA. So those two factors, the nature of the ground on which we live and our distance from the sun, will both influence our radiation dose. So every year, annual average background dose, again in these millisieverts, but we're just comparing things. If you live in LA, your dose would be 3 millisieverts. And if you live in Denver, it's 4 millisieverts. So that's 1 millisievert more. Doesn't sound like very much, but it's 30% more. So, I mean, if you wanted to, people are so afraid of radiation, if you wanted to reduce your radiation dose, you could reduce it by 30% by just moving from Denver to Los Angeles. But, you know, we have to sort of then average that out over a lifetime. So if you live in Denver all your life, you'll get 80 millisieverts more. So the point of all of this is that I'm going to show you some radiation doses from Chernobyl and Fukushima. And I want you just to try to remember that if you lived in Denver rather than LA, you would in your lifetime get 80 millisieverts more. We're going to see how these doses from these accidents compare to those 80 millisieverts. So there are places in the world actually that have much different doses. Goa, which is on the western coast of India, the annual dose is about 30 millisieverts, or 10 times higher than ours. And at Ramsar, which is a place in Iran, the annual dose is 200 millisieverts. But we don't see different cancer rates in any of these places. So that tells us that the range that which human beings can tolerate radiation is quite broad. It's 100-fold or more than 100-fold. Okay, and then we have another source of radiation, which is internal radiation. Everybody here is radioactive. You know, we all contain radionuclides that were released when the universe was created, right? So everyone has in them some of these radionuclides from the creation of the universe. And for example, carbon-14, rubidium, the ones I have as stars are ones that were from when the universe was created. The other ones are created more recently. But we have rubidium, we have lead, we have tritium and uranium. So everybody's radioactive, and if you're sitting next to someone, they're radiating you and you are irradiating them. Radioactive potassium tends to accumulate in muscles, and so males, on average, have more muscle mass than females. So males have more of this radioactive potassium than females, and so males are more radioactive. So if you're sitting next to a male, you're getting more radiation than if you were sitting next to a female. You're in a good situation because you're between two females, Ed. And when you sleep next to someone at night, of course, they're radiating you. And that dose over the course of a year is equivalent to a number of X-rays. One thing that I like to point out is that people don't realize is that cigarette smoking is a source of radiation. You know, everyone knows that cigarette smoking is associated with cancer. Why is that? Well, part of it is that polonium-210, which is another one of these radioisotopes from the creation of the universe, sticks to tobacco leaves. And when you smoke a cigarette, you vaporize and inhale this radioactive isotope. Oops. So now there's another, another place where we encounter radiation that we need it is, for example, in our exploration. So here's the Curiosity rover in the Gale crater. Here's the Gale crater here, and here's the rover, and we just had the anniversary of the rover, so some of you have seen these pictures, but you see this device here is I think I show it better here, yeah. So this is a plutonium-containing nuclear reactor. I mean, how is the rover going to get energy? It's mostly on the dark side of the moon, and so, you know, it needs to carry a little nuclear generator that keeps it going. And the same is true of lighthouses in the Arctic and a million other things. But what I wanted to going back to polonium-210, this aerosolized polonium gets dragged into the lungs, and it turns out that it's in exactly the places where we see lung cancer. So a substantial number of lung cancers are caused by radiation. Firstly, from radon that we're all exposed to, not so much in California, but if you have a basement and you live in the Rockies or on the East Coast, that accounts for about 20 or 30% of cases of lung cancer. And cigarette smoking is part of its cause, probably maybe most of its cause, is from radionuclides. So one of the things you can do if you want to stop someone from smoking is to tell them that they're getting radiation. I mean, that might be an additional incentive to stop smoking. This is Alexander Leffendenko, who was a KGB agent who retired and had some very nice things to say about Mr. Putin. He got ill and eventually died in a hospital in London. He really couldn't figure out what was going on before he died. He has these very typical loss of hair and so forth. But in any event, on autopsy, we found out that he had been poisoned with the same polonium-210 that people get from smoking. That is, some agents from the FSB put polonium-210 onto some sushi he ate in a London restaurant. And we couldn't detect it because it's an alpha emitter. It doesn't get out of the body. So putting a Geiger counter on someone is not going to reveal it. But when he died, we could detect that this was the... Okay, now if we move to the man-made side of things, we have occupational industrial. That's a very, very small part. This is nuclear reactors, the nuclear fuel cycle, mining uranium. And the big players here are medical things. So almost half of our radiation dose comes from physicians. Well, I showed you X-rays. I think you're all familiar with X-rays. But then we have CT scans, and they are a very big player. People can, and then in the extreme, we have something that we do quite often in oncology called a CT PET scan, positron emission tomography scan. So these radiological procedures deliver a very substantial dose of radiation to the population, half of the average American's dose. In the United States in 2012, there were 80 million CT scans. You know, that's one for every 3 or 4 Americans. And there were 20 million radioisotope scans, like a thyroid scan or things like that. And this comes out, when you put this all together, to 17 CT scans for every 100 Americans. Now, not to get lost in this, but these just show you the doses of these various CT scans. And for example, a heart angio has a dose of about 20 millisieverts. Well, that's about 7 times our background dose. So is that dangerous or not? Well, bear in mind that the average radiation dose to a person who survived Hiroshima was 200 millisieverts. So if you get a couple of these, which is not uncommon, or we do CT PETs all the time in staging cancer, if you get 7 of these, which is not uncommon, you will get the same dose as a person who survived the atomic bomb. So we're talking about important doses of radiation. Now, the paradox is that people are afraid to heat up their milk in the microwave oven, but sometimes they insist on getting a CT scan. The doctor doesn't want to do a CT scan, but the person wants a CT scan. Or someone in your family gives you a Christmas gift of a free CT scan, which you very happily receive. But, you know, so there is this paradox. People, in one instance, are very happy to be irradiated. In another instance, they're afraid of radiation that has no biological effect. Now, another issue that we come up against all the time are these backscatter X-ray imaging. I'm sure all of you have been trapped in a line, late for a flight, and someone refuses to go through the scanning device. Okay, does this make any sense? Well, firstly, do we need these scanning devices? Okay, so here is some girl who is on surface appearance, looks quite okay. Here's a frontal view. That's her belt buckle. But you can see that she's concealing this gun, which you could never detect by visual inspection. So we need these kinds of devices. Well, one backscatter scan. Now, you're not going to see backscatter scanner at LAX. They've been pulled for the moment. So don't have to worry about this right now. But they will be back. I'll show you. We use millimeter scanners, which are not radiation. But so one backscatter scan is equivalent to flying at 12,000 meters, or typical flying altitude, for 2 minutes, or just living on Earth for 42 minutes. So the point is, if you are afraid of radiation, don't fly, because every 2 minutes in flight is equivalent to a backscatter scan. So it's not the backscatter scan. If you're worried about radiation, don't get on a plane. Don't worry about the backscatter scanner. Just, this is what you are seeing today in the airport. This is a millimeter wave imaging. So this is not an ionizing radiation. So it's a different kind of thing. But you will see the backscatter scanners coming back. Okay, so now we have to talk about the biological effects of these radiations. And, they affect living organisms. And they, for example, can damage our chromosomes. So these are the chromosomes inside of a cell. And this is a kind of a chromosome that we call a dicentric chromosome, because it has 2 centers, dicentric. And we never see this in a normal human being, but we see it quite commonly after radiation exposure, and we, in fact, use it to evaluate what the dose of radiation is in an experiment. So if we put some radiation, photon or gamma rays, we don't have to get lost in this, but it causes a lot of damage to DNA, different kinds of damage and breaks and things of that nature. And I think this is an interesting thing, because we can actually visualize the damage being done. So this is the nucleus of a single cell. So you're looking at the nucleus, and you're looking at the path of a uranium atom going through. Each one of these is one uranium atom going through that cell. And every place you see yellow and red is where it's mutated DNA. So we can actually visualize the mutations in DNA. Now, the bone marrow, which is one of my favorite tissues as a hematologist, this is what your bone marrow normally looks like. These are big areas of fat, and these little blips here, they're all cells, individual cells, right? So about half of our bone marrow is filled with cells, and about half of our bone marrow is full of fat. So when you have bone marrow at a French restaurant, if your cholesterol is high, you shouldn't be having bone marrow. And this is what the bone marrow looks like after you expose it to radiation. The cells are gone. And this kind of a person would die of bone marrow failure, bleeding, and infection, and somewhat if we don't intervene. Okay, so there are various effects of radiation that occur at different points in time. There are some effects that occur right away, immediately. Those are the ones we deal with in radiation accidents. And there are some effects that occur over some years, like cataracts and things of that nature. But there are some effects that take decades and decades. So we still see elevated risks of cancer in the atomic bomb survivors from 1945. So this is a long-term proposition. So for these early effects, as I said, we have various interventions that I won't tell you about, but the extreme of it is to replace the bone marrow. Oh, this is just a picture of us in the OR in Moscow doing bone marrow transplants in a very limited number of people after the Chernobyl accident to replace this irreversibly damaged bone marrow. And then this is one of the firefighters from Chernobyl, Mr. Tomosian, who had a bone marrow transplant. And this is taken one Christmas ago in Moscow. This is his grandchild. So sometimes, we use these very rarely. They're very complex. but we do save people's lives. But the thing that people fear most about radiation are these late effects, the so-called stochastic effects. Stochastic effects is just a sort of semi-fancy scientific word meaning things that occur by chance. They occur randomly. And I say that stochastic effects are what people fear the most. It's because that's where cancer pops up. Cancer, birth defects, and genetic disorders. But the one that people, I think, fear the most, clearly, is cancer. So this is the risk of getting cancer after exposure to radiation. And this is the amount of radiation a person is exposed to. We've been talking about millisieverts, for example. And if we look at the atomic bomb survivors or other populations, we see a very clear linear relationship between the more radiation, the greater the cancer risk. But you notice that I stopped the line around 50 millisieverts. And that is because we don't have the statistical power. We don't have enough people to really know what goes on at these very low doses, which are the ones that actually we're most concerned about, are these low doses from CT scans, for example, would fall here, and things like that. So based on biological principles and based on experimental data, but not provable in humans, we consider this to be a linear relationship with no threshold. What does that mean? That means from this we conclude that any dose of radiation has the potential to increase cancer risk. So that every radiation exposure which is not necessary should be avoided in an effort to protect the public. Now, of course, this contradicts completely with something I told you earlier. I showed you that people live at tremendously different doses of radiation in Iran and Goa, but they don't have more cancer. But that could be because we don't have enough people to detect increased cancer risk. So from a public health protective perspective, we are assuming, and most scientists, not all, but most of us assume that there is a linear and no threshold relationship between exposure to radiation and the risks of causing cancer. Now, I hope I'm not going to ruin anybody's afternoon, but in considering cancer, we have to start off with what is our baseline cancer risk. And our baseline cancer risk is pretty high. Males, every male from birth has a 43% chance of getting cancer in their lifetime, and females slightly lower, 39%. So we have an almost 1 in 2 chance of getting cancer, all of us. Now, if we take males now and say, well, what happens if you expose a male to 10 millisieverts of radiation? Well, it goes up by 0.1%. Even if we expose someone to 50 millisieverts, well, then it goes up by 0.5%. And if we go up to 100 millisieverts, which sounds frightening, I'm going to give you an extra 100 millisieverts of radiation, sounds dreadful, but that only takes it up 1%. Now, this would be hard to detect. And I showed you that, for example, the Denver-LA comparison would fit in, we said it was 80 millisieverts. It would fit in around here, but we still can't detect it because we don't have, even though we have millions of people, it's not enough to detect this kind of increase. So those kind of numbers are hard for the public to understand, and so we tried various experiments on how to express this. So if you smoke cigarettes, a pack a day, this is how much of your life you will lose by various activities. So if you smoke a pack a day, you will lose 6 years of life. If you're significantly overweight, you lose 2 years of life. If you abuse alcohol, you lose a year of life. Accidents, a little bit less than a year. Natural hazards like earthquakes and typhoons. I was in a typhoon 2 days ago in Tokyo. 7 days. And 1 millisievert of radiation will cost you about 5 days. So that sort of gives you some scale. I mean, if you, if you're overweight, don't worry about radiation. lose weight. Now, another way to look at it is what's your chance of being killed? What's your chance of dying? So these things all have the same chance of dying. Smoking 14 cigarettes. Now, this is not 14 cigarettes a day. This is smoking 14 cigarettes, period, ever in your lifetime, which is the same as eating 25 cups of peanut butter. Now, peanut butter contains a chemical called aflatoxin, which causes liver cancer. So if you eat 25 cups of peanut butter or smoke 14 cigarettes, or you drive 600 kilometers or roughly 400 miles in your car, you have the same chance of death. Or fly, let's say, 25,000 miles in a plane. If you whitewater kayak for 15 minutes, if you have a fugu or a blowfish dinner in Japan, or you receive a millisievert of radiation, they all have about the same risk of death. So, if you wouldn't kayak, then you should worry about this. If you would be willing to eat a fugu dinner, then a millisievert of radiation is no greater risk of death. So if people want to reduce their cancer risk, they should focus on tobacco and alcohol and medical imaging procedures. That's where, we can save lives. Okay, so now we come to nuclear accidents. I didn't see this movie, but I saw a poster that said The Life of David Gale. I'm told it was a decent movie. I don't know if that's... But I'm going to tell you about the life of Robert Gale. So I've been involved in a number of radiation accidents and so forth. I won't go through all of them, but you've heard about Chernobyl and Fukushima. But there's lots of other accidents. And part of the experience is in analyzing their data from the atomic bomb survivors. Whoops. I've got this on my screen, but not. Let's see. So, I wonder if it's, there we go. Okay. That was the connector. So one question let's see if we missed anything. No, how do Chernobyl and Fukushima compare? Is a question I'm always asked. So this is a map of the spread of cesium-137. It's one of the radionuclides we're concerned about in human health context. The red is bad. I just think red is bad. Okay, so this is the spread of cesium over the European continent after the Chernobyl accident, and we want to compare that to roughly the same scale, the spread of cesium after the Fukushima accident. So you immediately see that we're dealing with entirely different, types of accidents. And that's because much of the cesium went into the ocean. But of course, you can see some of it arrives in California. And the two isotopes that we are most concerned about are iodine-131 and cesium-137. The units here are these units of radioactivity now, not dose, but radioactivity. These are petabecquerels for those that are interested. But if you look at iodine, it's about 10 times less for Fukushima. If you look at cesium, it's about 5 times less. So right away you see that the distribution of radioactivity and the amount of radioactivity are entirely different. We're very interested in iodine, or very concerned about iodine-131 because of its effect on the thyroid gland. And this is a map or a figure of the blue are boys and the red are girls. The incidence of thyroid cancer in young people after the Chernobyl accident. And you can see this dramatic increase, about 7,000 cases of thyroid cancer. And they were caused by a couple of variables. One is the ingestion of milk contaminated with iodine-131. We were unable to quarantine the milk because of infrastructure limitations. And then also because of infrastructure limitations, we were unable to distribute non-radioactive iodine, which would fill up the thyroid gland and prevent the uptake of radioactive iodine. And then finally, this area of Soviet Union is an area where people are deficient in iodine. So their thyroid gland wants iodine, and if some iodine goes by, happens to be radioactive, they Their thyroid gland sucks it up. And I'll show you why that's important in a minute. So these are our estimates. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have seen articles that thousands or tens of thousands of people died from Chernobyl, or were secretly buried, or I don't know what. But this is what's actually our estimates of what's going on. We're 26 years into this 80-year projection. We know there are 7,000 cases of thyroid cancer, but the estimates are between 6,000 and 16,000. Other cancers, all other cancers, over 80 years, between 11,000 and 25,000. But you have to remember that the number of cancers we expect in this population without the Chernobyl accident is about 200 million. So we would be looking for this increase in cancer in 200 million spontaneously occurring cancers. So this is virtually impossible to detect. So we never really know whether our estimates are correct or not. But that's what we think might happen. So our conclusions about Chernobyl so far is there was a marked increase in thyroid cancers, a couple of leukemias, we're not really certain that they're related. No convincing increase in any other cancer. Despite what you may have read, there's no evidence of any birth defects, and there's no evidence of any genetic abnormalities. So big accident, but I would say very modest effects. Remember that 2,000 people die every year mining coal. Every single year. Over 80 years, it would be 16,000 people, right? So, no, I'm 60,000 people. 160,000 people, sorry. So, Fukushima. Now, in the Fukushima accident, we were in a much better situation because Japan is much more developed. We have more experience and so forth and so on. So, we quarantined all of the milk. So no one was exposed, no child was exposed to radioactive milk. And we were able to distribute, not to everyone, but to most people, this non-radioactive form of iodine. And because Japanese eat so much seafood and their diet, they have a lot of iodine in their thyroid gland already. They have too much. And so they're not anxious to take up more iodine. So this is exactly the opposite of Chernobyl. And so our predictions for Fukushima are over 80 years now, between 0 and 100 cases of thyroid cancer, between 0 and 1,500 other cancers, and 20 million background cancers. So this is completely undetectable. I'll give you just one example. What we've done here is to take, I would say, the extreme worst case scenario. I showed you that city of Name, which is one of the most contaminated cities in Japan. And we assume that there's a child who was 1 year old at the time of the accident, and that he is never going to leave Name in his lifetime. And we've taken the upper boundary of every estimate of radiation-induced cancers. And so everything is set up to show what could be the worst thing that could possibly happen. Now, no child is being allowed to live in Name, so this is a hypothetical. It's not real. But if this were to happen, you can see here's that 43% baseline risk of cancer that he would have in his lifetime. And you can see that the excess cancer at the extreme would be 1%. So he would go from 43% to 44%. Now, of course, this is a hypothetical. No one is in this situation. So we're expecting, fundamentally few, if any, consequences. So few, if any, thyroid cancers from Fukushima, few, if any, leukemias, few, if any, other cancers, certainly no birth defects, and certainly no genetic abnormalities. And again, this is not what you would read in the newspaper or see on television. I regard it as, dog bites man is not news. Man bites dog is news. So nobody gets airtime for saying that nothing is going to happen. Now, the last way that we want to try to explain this to the public is to show a thermometer. So, blue is good, is cool, red is hot. So here is our baseline risk of cancer. This is this is a 1 in 10 chance to get cancer in your lifetime, 1 in 100 chance, 1 in 1,000 chance. So that's what the thermometer represents, the chance that you will get cancer from something. Okay, now we start off with a very high baseline risk. It's almost 1 in 2. So we're already up here on the thermometer. If you're a smoker, of course, it's even worse. It's more than 1 in 2. But if you have a CT scan, that is about 1 in 400 or 500 that you'll get cancer from that. And we sort of regard risks in the public domain of about 1 in 10,000 as being insignificant. So where does Fukushima come out? Well, something about 1 in 9,000, something like that on average. So, I mean, if you would not hesitate to have a CT scan, if your doctor recommended it, or if you're a smoker, you know, Fukushima is, you know, really getting close to negligible risk. Which brings us to the issue of nuclear energy. So this is, you know, the New York skyline from the Brooklyn Bridge, or from what's now called Brooklyn Bridge Park. And this was during the Great Blackout. So, you know, we are heavily, heavily dependent on energy to keep our lives going, to keep our cities lighted, etc. So our energy sources in 2013 look something like this. You know, hydrocarbons are the dominant player. Nuclear is about 20%, and then you have these other contributors. They're important, but they are small, and they are not going to increase substantially for a variety of reasons I don't have time to discuss. There are some extreme costs that we pay for dependence on fossil fuels. We have the direct deaths. I mentioned 2,000 deaths a year from mining alone. We have global warming. We fight wars over oil. And the cost is extraordinary, $400 billion a year. Every year, we have the greatest transfer of wealth than in the entire antecedent history of mankind. Now, you know, if I ask people, would you like to have a home near a nuclear power station or a coal-burning power station? I think most people would say, I'd rather have a home in Bel Air. But if you don't have a home in Bel Air and you have to choose between those other two, most people would choose a coal-burning power station. But this just shows you how much radiation is released from a coal power station versus a nuclear power station for the same amount of energy. You know, coal comes from the earth, and I showed you that the earth is radioactive. So when you burn coal, you of course release radioactivity into the air. So you can see that under normal circumstances, this is not a nuclear accident, but under normal circumstances, coal releases 100 times more radiation than nuclear energy. So if you're worried about radiation, then you want to live next to a nuclear power station. You don't want to live next to a coal power station. Now, if we look at deaths per terawatt, which is just some measure of electrical generation, well, let's look at accidents. Coal versus nuclear. You can see that there are about 10 times more deaths at accidents from coal than there are from nuclear. And then we can look at indirect deaths, which is really the important thing, which is deaths from air pollution, meaning emphysema, bronchitis, things of that nature, asthma. Okay, you can see, you know, it's more than 100-fold greater for coal than it is for nuclear. So these are just, I mean, I'm not taking a position. I'm just trying to show you some of the facts so you can make intelligent choices. So, of course, you know, with all these accidents, and the question comes up, should we stop nuclear energy? We can. Japan has. So all the nuclear reactors were shut down on March 11th at the time of the Fukushima accident. So here's the carbon footprint of Japan before the accident, and here's the carbon footprint, carbon intensity, as soon as the reactors are closed. So you can shut them down, but you're going to pay a very heavy price. Japan will not be able to meet its commitments in the conventions we have for the reduction of carbon emissions. We have this issue of global warming that is the direct consequence of that carbon intensity that I showed you a minute ago. And this is a rather depressing slide. What it shows is the carbon content of the global energy supply. And these are projections under different scenarios. So the first thing is that if you go back to 1975, and particularly in recent years, when there's been endless talk about reducing dependence on hydrocarbons, you can see that absolutely no change. There's been absolutely no change in global carbon content. So all this talk, all these windmills, everything, et cetera, has actually not changed anything. And if we continue on that path, which is the most likely scenario, then there's going to be a 6 degrees Celsius rise by 2050. So that's the most likely scenario. But even radical interventions will only, at the very best, result in a 2 Celsius rise. So, that increase in carbon footprint is not to be taken lightly, especially by the third largest economy in the world. And then we have these other issues with carbon that people tend to forget. I mean, when I say Deepwater Horizon, people, what are you talking about? But, we have big accidents. Fukushima is in the news every single day. But Deepwater Horizon, sounds like a cruise ship to most people. Exxon Valdez, if I ask young people if they know what the Exxon Valdez is, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So that brings us to this issue of nuclear energy. So if we want to advance nuclear energy, and that's a big if, because there are these emotional baggage that may or may not be surmountable, but we have to have safer reactors. We need safe used nuclear fuel storage. We need cheaper reactors, and we need international safety standards. So safer reactors, I mean, the General Electric Mark I reactors, which the ones that are in place in Chernobyl, in Fukushima, are fundamentally equivalent to a Model T. I mean, they are old, they represent technology. It'd be like flying in a 707. I mean, nobody flies a 707 anymore. What we need are Ferraris, not Model Ts. We have some things that are advancing. These are the advanced process 1000 reactors. 2 of them are being installed in the United States right now. A lot of other countries are building them, China, for example. And then we have some even third-generation reactors that don't rely on water, which is one of our weak spots. They rely on things like helium to cool the reactor. So there are advances but they're expensive. We need to get over this, what is fundamentally a political and not a technical problem of storing used nuclear fuels, which are just sitting in tanks all over the country right now. We have these dry cask storage here in California. So some of the ponds have been emptied and put into dry cask storage, but very few. And then we have this endless political controversy over Yucca Mountain, which has got to be resolved. It's not a scientific issue, in my opinion. It's a political issue. We need cheaper reactors. San Onofre was closed fundamentally for economic reasons. With shale oil and gas being so cheap right now, utilities don't want to run or invest in nuclear power stations. They're driven by the bottom line. If you're the CEO of Edison, you're not interested in global carbon footprint. You're interested in the bottom line of your company. So, that is a huge concern, that we will just get rid of all nuclear energy, not, for the wrong reason, because it's just not economically attractive. Because you need a 50-year horizon when you look at energy, not a 5-year horizon. And then we've got to make these things cheaper. These are small modular reactors. They're not small trust me, a man would be about this tall here. But they're much smaller than the current reactors we have, and you can build them and transport them, and you can assemble them. And then we need international safety standards. This is a commercial reactor, not a military reactor in Bushehr, Iran. And these are some satellite photos from US satellites. And I just want to show you this picture. This is where the reactor is. I'm sorry, down here. Here's Bushehr. And, you know, we don't have any control over the safety of that reactor. And just look at, you can imagine, here's the Persian Gulf with our whole flow of Middle East oil going through it. So an accident at this reactor would be disastrous for everybody in the developed world. Okay, finally, I'm going to close, if I can, with a word about nuclear weapons. We've got different kinds of nuclear weapons, of course, fission weapons and fusion weapons and neutron weapons, which have not been developed, but these are the weapons that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the number of megatons it discharged. So this is the, just again, don't worry about the units, just look at the scale. So here's the Hiroshima bomb, little boy, and then here is the modern A-bomb, which you can see is more than 1,000 times. Each modern A-bomb is more than 1,000 times, and a modern hydrogen bomb is more than 10,000 times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Japan. I think it's interesting, little boy, the Hiroshima bomb, the bomb weighed 5 tons. It was quite heavy. But the amount of uranium in it, U-235, was only 80 kilograms, or roughly 170 pounds, let's say. But I showed you those pictures of the destruction of Hiroshima. That destruction came from the energy released by 700 milligrams of this uranium. 700 milligrams is a few grains of rice. So the total amount of mass converted into energy you could hold in your hand. So, you know, this is a potentially huge source of energy to us if we could figure out how to use it properly. And that's what that's what these grains of rice did to Hiroshima. Now, it's very hard to know exactly how many people died, but I think a reasonable estimate is 120,000 people, and about 60 or 70,000 at Nagasaki. About 90,000 died immediately, and another 30,000 over the years. But I think what most people don't realize, and we were discussing this at lunch, perhaps an odd lunchtime discussion, is why people die from atomic bombs. The blast kills about half of them. And thermal injuries kill about more than a third. And radiation actually contributes a very small amount. It's not, I don't want to trivialize it, but only 10% of the deaths from a nuclear weapon are from radiation. The rest of it is exactly what happens when you have a conventional weapon. So if we look at Hiroshima, 120 deaths, Nagasaki, 60 or 70,000, but the firebombing of Tokyo with conventional weapons shortly before that killed 100,000 people. And Dresden firebombing, 25,000 people. So, killing any number of people, starting at 1, is not a good idea. Although Stalin said, if you kill 1 person, it's a tragedy. If you kill 1 million people, it's a statistic. But he was not a nice guy, anyway. But my point really is that it's not that nuclear weapons kill more people, and they don't kill them in a very special way. What's impressive about nuclear weapons is you only need 1 of them. Okay? But killing people is easily doable with conventional weapons at the same magnitude and by the same means. So, if we look at what happened after the A-bombs and these people that died because of the A-bombs, so the A-bombs contributed about 40% of the leukemias that are ultimately developed in the atomic bomb survivors. So if we look at cancers, and again, this is, I think, would be news to many of you. You know, of course, everyone who was exposed to the atomic bombs and gets cancer thinks that they got cancer because of the atomic bomb. But actually, only about 9% of the cancers can be attributed to radiation, and the other 90% are spontaneously occurring cancers. They would have occurred anyway. So there's a misimpression that the nuclear weapons kill people by radiation, which is not true. And there's an impression that they cause huge numbers of cancers. And they do cause cancer, for sure. But the numbers of cancers is very small compared to the spontaneous rate of cancer. Okay, and then, but our big problem is nuclear weapon states in unstable regions. North Korea, I mean, you've got this, I would say, ill-trained teenager running a country that has nuclear weapons. They have not only nuclear weapons, this is their nuclear weapons site, but they have delivery systems that can bring these weapons close to U.S. territories. And then you have, you know, a lot of nuclear weapons in places like Pakistan, which is, you know, has some kind of terrorist attack daily, sometimes more. So they've got, you know, 200 nuclear weapons spread all over the country, in a country that has this as a daily event. Places like Iran, you know, everybody, unless they're living under a stone, I think the expression is, knows what's going on in Iran. But they have, you know, recently activated what they call a commercial reactor, but we regard as a place that is capable of producing weapons-grade materials. And then the final thing I'm going to touch on is just nuclear terrorism, which is something that we as physicians are very concerned with. I mean, there are lots of ways to terrorize the public with radiation. For example, an improvised nuclear device. And the simplest thing is just to take, you know, some kind of an explosive and, you know, take some TNT and just, you know, dab some radioactive material on it. And that was one of the thoughts that occurred immediately to many of us after the Boston Marathon bombing. And you don't know it, but I can assure you that people with radiation detection devices were in there instantaneously. Fortunately, that was not the case. But there are other nasty ways. I mean, you can just take you know, a Cessna and fly over a field and drop a bunch of radioactivity. And then we have to deal with contaminated people and so decontaminate them and so forth and so on. You can put a radioactive device on a thing like a commuter train. There are tens and tens of thousands of radioactive devices in the United States. And it's very hard to guarantee the safety of all of them. So you go on Amtrak and put one of these devices on, you know, you can have a lot of adverse effects. Well, these are regarded as weapons of mass destruction, but in fact, they are weapons of mass disruption, not destruction. The actual radiological consequences of these devices is incredibly small, and we can handle that. What we can't handle is the fact that the public doesn't understand and politicians don't understand what these devices can and cannot do. And therefore, you're likely to get huge areas of a city evacuated for no reason, or you know, military actions that are prompted by a lack of understanding of the consequences of radiological dispersion. So that's our major problem. It's not destruction, but disruption. And we depend on an educated public. We have to educate the public as to the realistic consequences of these nuclear terroristic devices. So my final message is keep calm and carry on. I'm afraid I've used more than my proper amount of time, so I have about 5 minutes for questions, but we may be out of the room, I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Gale. It's truly amazing, and I must say somewhere between comforting and terrifying. And, please, we only have time for a limited number, so let's make them questions. First one right up front.
As an example, when you use Fukushima, the amount of iodine or thyroid cancers, what is the source of those statistics? Is it from the Japanese government or the utility, or where do you get your numbers?
Well, Fukushima, we haven't, nothing is happening. It's too early. But there's a program in Fukushima Prefecture where every child between the ages of 2 and 18 at the time of the accident is having a ultrasound study of their thyroid gland every 2 years. So there will be a large data set. So far, about 17 thyroid cancers have been detected, but we don't have any evidence that these are from Fukushima, because we don't normally do ultrasound studies in 2-year-olds. So we have to show that there's an actual correlation with dose. So this is a study that would take about 20 years, but that will be the source of data. Now in Chernobyl, childhood thyroid cancer is very rare. So 7,000 cases, we don't need statistics, to know that that something's going on. But Fukushima, we may never know what's going on.
Is your presentation available to the public in any way? Is your presentation available online or to the public or CD or anything?
Yeah, no, we can talk about that. Yeah,
I believe it's being videotaped and will be available.
Yeah, okay, so it's being videotaped. Maybe one more question is all I have time for.
Thank you again for your presentation, Dr. Gale. It's a pleasure. This incident at Beverly Hills High School, there's been a number of cases reported about exposure causing cancer. Are you familiar with anything with that?
Yeah, I am familiar with that. But that was chemical exposures, right? Not radiation.
I believe that's correct. It was regarding the oil.
Yeah, it had to do with the fact that there was chemical releases, and the claim is yet unsettled that there were more cases of Hodgkin's disease and lymphomas in some high school students. But it's a contentious issue, and it's gone to litigation.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay. Thank you very, very much.